Welcome to this journey through the North Caucasus, a remarkable region where Europe meets Asia along the dramatic spine of the Caucasus Mountains. This is a land of extraordinary diversity, home to dozens of distinct ethnic groups, each with their own languages, traditions, and stories spanning millennia. From ancient kingdoms and legendary warriors to vibrant folk traditions and resilient communities, we'll explore how geography, history, and culture have intertwined to create one of the world's most fascinating and complex regions. Join us as we discover the peoples and heritage of the North Caucasus. Chapter 1. Bronze Age Civilizations of the Caucasus. Long before the great empires of Rome and Persia cast their shadows across the ancient world, the valleys and highlands of the North Caucasus teemed with sophisticated civilizations whose achievements would echo through millennia. These were not primitive settlements scratching out a meager existence in isolated mountain villages, but complex societies that mastered the arts of metallurgy, created stunning works of art, and established trade networks spanning thousands of miles across the ancient world. The story of these ancient peoples begins not with written records, but with the patient work of archaeologists who have uncovered their legacy buried beneath the earth. When excavators carefully brush away the soil from burial mounds and ancient settlements, they reveal a picture of human achievement that challenges our assumptions about the ancient Caucasus. This was a crossroads of innovation, a place where cultural influences from Mesopotamia, the Eurasian steppes, and Anatolia met and merged with indigenous traditions to create something entirely unique. The foundations of human settlement in the Caucasus reach back to astonishing depths of time. At Dranisi in Georgia, excavators uncovered a skull dating to 1.8 million years ago, among the earliest Homo erectus fossils found anywhere outside Africa, establishing that human ancestors walked these landscapes in the deep Paleolithic past. Later Stone Age cultures left their own distinctive marks on the region. The Imeritan culture, which flourished during the Upper Paleolithic, developed sophisticated stoneworking techniques, including the microburin method for producing geometric microliths, tiny, precise blades that could be hafted into composite tools. At Azek Cave, archaeologists found pre-Acheulean stone tools dating to 700,000 years ago, evidence of the remarkably long human story in this region. By the Neolithic period, communities like those of the Shulavari-Shamutepe culture had established permanent villages in the 6th and 5th millennia before our era. These early settlers built circular mud brick houses with dome-shaped roofs, crafted pottery decorated with intricate engravings, and created small clay figurines, particularly of women, which archaeologists have found in remarkable quantities at sites like Kromistidi Gora in Georgia. These figurines hint at spiritual beliefs and social practices that we can only glimpse from a distance of 8,000 years. But it is with the Maykop culture that the Bronze Age Caucasus truly announces itself to history with spectacular fanfare. Between 3,700 and 3,000 years before our era, the tribes of the Maykop culture dominated the northwestern and central portions of the North Caucasus. More than 200 Bronze Age sites attributed to this culture have been discovered, stretching over 60 miles from the Kuban River to the city of Nalchik. Yet it is not the number of sites that captures our imagination, but rather what lies within them. The Maykop culture is perhaps best known for its burial practices and the extraordinary grave goods that accompany the dead into the afterlife. These were not simple earth graves, but imposing burial mounds called kurgans that rose prominently from the landscape, announcing the importance of those interred within. Some of these earthen monuments reached considerable heights, their construction requiring the coordinated labor of entire communities, each basket of soil carried and placed with purpose. When archaeologists opened these ancient tombs, they found treasures that speak to both the wealth and the artistic sophistication of Maykop society. Imagine silver vessels so finely crafted that their surfaces shimmer with depictions of animals, their forms captured with remarkable naturalism and skill. Picture gold plates shaped like bulls and lions, designed to be sewn onto garments, transforming the wearer into a figure of power and prestige. These were not merely decorative items, but symbols of status, markers of a hierarchical society where some individuals commanded extraordinary resources and respect. The pottery of the Maikop culture reveals equal attention to craft. Artisans created handmade vessels with engraved decorations, working local clay mixed with grog and basalt as temper to create ceramics that were both functional and aesthetically pleasing. The careful selection of tempering materials speaks to accumulated knowledge about how different additives affected the clay's workability and the final vessel's durability. What makes these findings even more remarkable is the evidence they provide of far-flung trade networks. Among the grave goods, archaeologists have identified lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, a brilliant blue stone that had traveled over 2,000 miles to reach the Caucasus. Turquoise beads came from northeastern Iran and Tajikistan, while red carnelian pearls originated in what is now western Pakistan. Bronze weapons and elaborate necklaces complete the picture of a culture deeply connected to the broader ancient world, participating in exchange networks that linked the Mediterranean to Central Asia. Archaeological evidence, combined with recent studies, suggests local development of this sophisticated culture rather than direct migration from Mesopotamia, a creative synthesis of indigenous progression and external influences. While the Maikop culture flourished in the northwestern Caucasus, a different but equally significant culture was taking shape primarily in the South Caucasus and the eastern portions of the North Caucasus. The Kura-Araxes culture, named after two major rivers of the region, emerged around 4,000 years before our era and persisted until roughly 2,000 years before our era. This culture would come to characterize life across a vast territory, showing remarkable similarities with the Maikop culture while maintaining its own distinctive characteristics. The archaeological fingerprint of the Kura-Araxes culture is found most distinctively in its pottery. Unlike the elaborate metal goods of the Maikop burials, the Kura-Araxes people are best known for their distinctive ceramic vessels, colored black or red and decorated with geometric designs. These patterns, found primarily in areas of Dagestan and Chechnya, represent more than mere decoration. They speak to shared aesthetic values and possibly to common symbolic or ritual meanings that unified communities across considerable distances. The main archaeological findings of the Kura-Araxes culture have been discovered throughout the South Caucasus and in the eastern part of the North Caucasus. Sites have been identified on the periphery of intermountain zones, regions that provided access to fresh water, as well as to the main routes between plains like those of Tsakhovit, Shirak, and Aparan. In western Azerbaijan, at sites like Mentish Tepe, the Nakhchivan region, the Baba Dervish group in the Akstafa district, and at Ovlakar Tepe, archaeologists have found elements belonging to what they identify as the late Chalcolithic Kura-Araxes tradition. The cultural reach extended even to the northern and northeastern boundaries of Dagestan, Chechnya, and Ingushetia. The settlements of the Kura-Araxes people reveal much about how they organized their lives and communities. In their earliest phase, these communities initially constructed circular dwellings, echoing older Neolithic traditions, but soon transitioned to rectangular structures. This architectural evolution represents more than an aesthetic preference. It reflects changing social organization and perhaps increasing population density. The rectangular form allowed for more efficient use of space and easier expansion of settlements. In larger villages, houses were arranged in orderly rows, each dwelling featuring flat roofs and typically containing two rooms, a small antechamber that led into a larger main room. One can imagine entering through the narrow anteroom, a transitional space that separated the outside world from the domestic sphere before stepping into the main living area where daily life unfolded. This layout would become a template for domestic architecture in the region for centuries to come. These settlements were strategically located, either in valley floors or on terraces in the foothills of southern Georgia, positions that balanced accessibility with defensive advantage. The Kura-Araxes people were skilled at reading their landscape, choosing locations that provided protection while allowing them to exploit the agricultural potential of the surrounding lands. In some areas, particularly in eastern Georgia, we find evidence of the Kura-Araxes culture mixing with other local traditions, such as the Upper Emiratian cave cultures, suggesting that cultural boundaries were permeable and that innovation often occurred at the intersections of different communities. As the Bronze Age progressed and gave way to the Iron Age, a new culture emerged that would become legendary for its metallurgical prowess and artistic achievement. The Koban culture, which flourished from approximately 1100 to 400 years before our era, represents the late Bronze Age and Iron Age culture of the northern and central Caucasus. Discovered and named after artifacts found near the village of Koban in northern Ossetia in 1869, this culture would come to define an era. The geographic extent of the Koban culture was impressive, reaching across much of the North Caucasus into areas that now comprise Ingushetia, Kabardino-Balkaria, Karachay-Cherkessia, and North Ossetia-Alania, and even extending into South Ossetia and the high northwestern regions of Georgia, such as Racha and Swaneti. Some areas of the northeast Caucasus also hosted Koban settlements, particularly in what is now Ingushetia and the western regions of Chechnya. To the north, the culture extended as far as the Terek River and to the Laba River in the Krasnodar area. But it is not the geographic spread alone that makes the Koban culture remarkable. What truly sets it apart is the extraordinary level of artistic and technical skill displayed in its metalwork. The surviving bronze items reflect a level of mastery that commands respect even today. Museum collections around the world preserve Koban artifacts that showcase the ancient master's abilities, pieces that blend functionality with stunning aesthetic achievement. Consider the ram-headed pendant, one of the finest examples of Koban artistry. The craftsman who created this piece captured not just the physical form of the animal, but its essential character, the curve of the horns and the alert stance rendered in bronze with both naturalism and stylization. The pendant transforms the ram into a wearable symbol, perhaps of strength, perhaps of protection, its meaning now lost, but its artistry enduring. Among the most impressive Koban innovations was their use of vitreous enamel to decorate metal objects. This technique involves fusing glass to metal at high temperatures, a process that requires considerable technical knowledge and skill. The metalworker must understand not only the properties of bronze, but also the chemistry of glass, the precise temperatures needed to create fusion without destroying the piece, and the timing required to achieve the desired effect. The presence of fired enamel on bronze items confirms that Koban metalworkers had mastered this challenging art form, creating pieces where color and metallic sheen combine to produce objects of remarkable beauty. Bronze buckles adorned with remnants of vitreous enamel, decorated bronze belts, and other items demonstrate a civilization at the height of its creative powers. These were not crude implements, but carefully crafted works that required years of training to produce. The metallurgists of the Koban culture represented a specialized class of craftspeople, their skills passed down through apprenticeship, their products circulating through networks of exchange that connected mountain communities to the wider world. The Koban culture's relationship to later peoples of the region remains a subject of fascinating scholarly debate. Some researchers, noting the concentration of Koban sites in areas associated with the Nak peoples, believe that the Koban culture was primarily created by the ancestors of today's Chechens and Ingush. They point to the archaeological continuity in central Dagestan, stretching back some 8,000 years, suggesting deep indigenous roots. Whether the Koban culture or the slightly later Karachoy culture represents the first distinctly Chechen cultural expression, it seems clear that the roots of these mountain peoples stretch back 3,000 to 4,000 years into the Bronze Age. What brought the Koban culture to an end? Some scholars suggest that invasions by Scythian nomads from the steppes disrupted the established patterns of life, perhaps overwhelming the highland settlements or severing the trade routes that sustained them. Certainly, the archaeological record shows changes around 400 years before our era, as the distinctive Koban style gives way to new cultural expressions influenced by the mounted warriors of the plains. The legacy of these ancient cultures extends far beyond the dates of their flourishing. The Maikop, Kura-Araxes, and Koban cultures established patterns that would shape the Caucasus for millennia to come. They demonstrated that the mountain valleys could sustain sophisticated civilizations, that difficult terrain need not be a barrier to cultural achievement. The metalworking techniques they perfected, the architectural forms they developed, and the trade networks they established created foundations upon which later societies would build. The transition from circular to rectangular housing, the mastery of bronze casting and enameling, the development of distinctive pottery styles, all these innovations became part of the cultural inheritance of the North Caucasus. The burial mounds of Maikop still dot the landscape. The geometric patterns on Kura-Araxes pottery echo in later decorative traditions, and the metalworking expertise of Koban craftsmen established a regional reputation that would persist through the centuries. These ancient achievements form the bedrock upon which the complex ethnic and cultural mosaic of the modern Caucasus stands, connecting today's diverse peoples to ancestors who walked these same valleys and carved their stories into bronze and stone 4,000 years ago. Chapter 2: Genetic Ancestry and Population Origins. For centuries, the only way to understand the ancestry and movements of ancient peoples was through the artifacts they left behind, the structures they built, and the sparse written records that survived. But in recent decades, a revolution in scientific technology has opened an entirely new window into the past. By extracting and analyzing DNA from both ancient skeletal remains and modern populations, researchers can now trace the movements of peoples across millennia, identify relationships between distant groups, and answer questions that traditional archaeology alone could never resolve. Nowhere has this genetic revolution been more illuminating than in the Caucasus, a region whose extraordinary diversity has long puzzled scholars. The story of genetic research in the Caucasus begins with a remarkable discovery that would reshape our understanding of European origins. In 2015, a team of geneticists led by Jones and colleagues identified a previously unknown ancestral lineage that they dubbed Caucasian hunter-gatherer, or CHG. This finding emerged from the careful analysis of ancient DNA extracted from two individuals found in western Georgia at the Kotias Klelde cave, dating to 13,300 BCE, and the Satsarblia cave, dating to 9,700 BCE. When researchers compared these ancient genomes to those of other prehistoric Europeans, including Western hunter-gatherers and early Anatolian farmers, they discovered something unexpected. The genetic data revealed that the CHG lineage had separated from Western European hunter-gatherer lineages approximately 45,000 years ago, around the presumed time of the original peopling of Europe. In other words, when modern humans first spread across the European continent, different groups took different paths and developed distinct genetic signatures. The ancestors of the CHG lineage established themselves in the Caucasus region, while other groups settled in Western and Northern Europe. The CHG lineage separated from early Anatolian farmers later, at approximately 25,000 years ago, during the last glacial maximum, when ice sheets covered much of Northern Europe and forced human populations into southern refugia. These were separate divergence events that established the CHG as a genetically distinct population. This ancient Caucasian genetic signature did not remain confined to the mountain valleys. In fact, the CHG ancestry played a crucial role in shaping populations far beyond the Caucasus itself. Individuals from the Neolithic and Bronze Age periods found in the Samara region of Russia, dating from 5,200 to 4,000 BCE, carried an equal mixture of Eastern European hunter-gatherer and CHG ancestry. This blended genetic profile came to be known as steppe ancestry, and it was this population that would eventually expand westward into Europe and eastward toward the Altai region and South Asia, profoundly influencing the genetic makeup of peoples across a vast swath of Eurasia. The identification of CHG ancestry has helped resolve one of the great puzzles of European prehistory. For years, scholars wondered about the origins of the populations that spread across Europe during the Bronze Age, bringing new technologies, languages, and cultural practices. Now we know that the Caucasus served as one of the crucial source regions for these migrations, contributing roughly half of the ancestry that characterizes the steppe populations who would later reshape Europe. This makes the Caucasus not merely a crossroads of cultures, but a genetic wellspring that helped create the modern European population. Studies of individuals from the Yamnaya culture, the steppe pastoralists who expanded westward around 3000 BCE, revealed subtle genetic traces characteristic of neighboring farming populations of southeastern Europe. Detailed analysis showed that this gene flow could not be linked to populations from the Caucasus, but must have come from the west, perhaps from groups such as the globular amphora culture. The Mycop culture of the northwestern North Caucasus, 3700 minus 3000 BCE, once thought to represent Mesopotamian migration based on its rich grave goods described in Chapter 1, was revealed through DNA analysis to have developed locally with distinct southern Caucasus ancestry already present by the 5th millennium BCE, not from Mesopotamian colonization. These findings highlight the complexity of the processes that led to the formation of Bronze Age steppe pastoralist populations, showing that genetic exchange occurred in multiple directions and involved numerous populations. But what about the people who live in the Caucasus today? How did their genes connect them to these ancient populations? And what can modern DNA tell us about the region's complex history? The answers reveal patterns that are both surprising and illuminating. Consider the case of the Armenians and Azerbaijanis, two major populations of the southern Caucasus. Linguistically, these groups appear to have clear connections to peoples far beyond the region. Armenian is an Indo-European language, though it stands alone as an isolate branch within that family. Azerbaijani is a Turkic language closely related to Turkish, Turkmen, and Gagauz, linking its speakers to populations stretching from Anatolia to Central Asia. Given these linguistic connections, one might expect the genetic ancestry of these populations to similarly point outward from the Caucasus. Yet, genetic studies paint a very different picture. Research by Naside, Stomaking, and colleagues in 2001 revealed that both Armenians and Azerbaijanis are genetically more closely related to their geographic neighbors in the Caucasus than to their linguistic relatives elsewhere. When geneticists analyze the gene pools of these populations, they find that they are intermediate between Europeans and Near Eastern populations of the Northern Fertile Crescent, including Turks, Kurds, and Iraqi and North African Jews. This genetic positioning suggests a deep history in the region, one that predates the arrival of the languages they now speak. These findings point to a process that archaeologist Colin Renfrew termed elite dominance, whereby a relatively small invading group imposes its language on a larger resident population without substantially altering its genetic composition. In the case of Azerbaijan, historical records indicate that the Turkic language was likely introduced in the 11th century CE by Central Asian nomads. Before that time, the ancestors of today's Azerbaijanis spoke different languages, perhaps related to the ancient Caucasian Albanian tongue. But when Turkic-speaking groups arrived, whether through conquest or the prestige associated with the newcomers, the local population gradually adopted the new language while retaining most of their genetic heritage. The Azerbaijanis are thus descendants of ancient Caucasian populations who underwent a linguistic transformation. The Armenian case presents similar patterns. The genetic evidence makes clear that Armenians, like Azerbaijanis, are fundamentally a Caucasian people whose ancestors were among the Neolithic migrants from the Near East who settled in the region thousands of years ago. Their adoption of an Indo-European language did not erase their deeper genetic connections to the Caucasus homeland. This pattern of genetic continuity, combined with linguistic change, is not limited to the Southern Caucasus. Recent research on the Mingalians, a population living in the Semegrelo region of western Georgia, provides even more detailed insights into how populations have maintained their genetic identity while participating in broader cultural and linguistic transformations. In a comprehensive 2023 study by Schur and colleagues, researchers examined DNA from 485 individuals from 30 different locations in Semegrelo. They generated mitochondrial DNA sequences for all 485 participants, Y chromosome STR haplotypes for the 372 male participants, and analyzed nearly 590,000 autosomal single nucleotide polymorphisms using advanced genomic technology. The results revealed a population with considerable genetic diversity, but also remarkable cohesion. The mitochondrial DNA analysis showed that Mingalians possess high frequencies of common West Eurasian haplogroups, including H, HV, I, J, K, N1, R1, R2, T, U, W, and X2, along with low frequencies of East Eurasian haplogroups such as A, C, D, F, and G. This pattern confirms the predominantly West Eurasian ancestry of the population while also documenting the minor genetic influences from more distant regions, perhaps reflecting ancient trade contacts or small-scale migrations. The Y chromosome data proved equally revealing. Mingalian men carried a variety of haplogroups, including E1b1b, G2a, I2, J1, J2, L, Q, R1, and R1b. This diversity speaks to multiple ancestral lineages contributing to the modern population. Yet, when researchers examined the autosomal DNA, which provides a more complete picture of overall ancestry, they found that Mingalians are genetically homogeneous and cluster closely with other modern South Caucasus populations. Most significantly, when the team compared their data with ancient DNA samples from Bronze Age archaeological sites in the broader region, they discovered that the genetic profile of modern Mingrelians had begun taking its current form at least by the Bronze Age, probably in conjunction with the formation of a distinct linguistic community. In other words, the people we today call Mingrelians have maintained genetic continuity in western Georgia for at least 3,000 years, even as empires rose and fell around them, even as new religions and political systems swept through the region. This finding of long-term genetic continuity extends to other Caucasian populations as well. A 2020 study by Buligina and colleagues focusing on the Svan people, who inhabit some of the most remote highland valleys of Georgia, revealed high mitochondrial haplotypic diversity even among these putatively endogamous populations. Rather than showing the genetic bottlenecks one might expect from small, isolated communities, the Svans display diversity, suggesting multiple ancient introgressions into their mountain refuges. The tight genetic clustering between populations speaking languages from entirely different families, such as Abkhaz, Svan, and Ossetian, further indicates the continuity of lineages from a time preceding linguistic diversification in the region. The relationship between genetics and geography in the Caucasus reveals additional fascinating patterns. A major 2011 study by Balanovsky and colleagues examined populations across the entire Caucasus region and found that each major ethno-linguistic group appeared to be associated with its own predominant genetic signature. The Northwest Caucasian groups, the Turkic-speaking groups, the Iranian-speaking Ossetians, the Nakh-speaking Ingush and Chechens, and the groups speaking Northeast Caucasian languages all showed distinctive genetic profiles that correlated strongly with both their linguistic affiliation and their geographic location. This correlation is not accidental, but rather reflects the powerful influence of the region's mountainous terrain. A 2019 study by Wang and colleagues identified a genetic boundary that corresponds to ecological and geographical regions, specifically the division between the mountains and the steppe. During the Bronze Age, populations living throughout the Caucasus region were genetically similar, despite the harsh mountain terrain. But there existed a sharp genetic boundary to the adjacent steppe areas in the north. Today, the Caucasus Mountains themselves have become more of a barrier to gene flow, with populations on different sides of the range showing distinct genetic characteristics. Yet, this does not mean the mountains created complete isolation. One of the most intriguing findings from genetic research in the Caucasus involves what linguists call vertical bilingualism and its relationship to genetic patterns. In the mountain valleys, particularly in Dagestan, villages are arranged in a vertical hierarchy based on altitude. Residents of highland villages, typically men, participate in seasonal migrations to lowland regions that offer markets and winter pastures. These men generally know the language of the lower villages, but the reverse is not true. Over generations, this pattern has created a situation where highland populations show genetic influence from lowland groups in their Y chromosome lineages, reflecting patrilocal movement patterns, while maintaining their distinct highland mitochondrial DNA signatures, which trace maternal lineages. Consider the Czech languages, including Bezhta, Hunzib, Ditto, Hinuk, and Kwarshi. Linguist Johanna Nichols has demonstrated that this branch split from the rest of the Dagestanian language family earliest, around 2,000 years ago, and today these languages are spoken at the highest altitudes along the crest of the mountain range. The Andic languages, including Akvach, Andi, Bagval, Batlich, Chamalal, Godaberi, Karata, and Tindi, whose separation from the rest of the family tree is more recent, occupy the medium altitude belt. Meanwhile, the relatively new and structurally simplified Avar language is spoken at the lowest altitudes and serves as a lingua franca across much of Dagestan. This vertical linguistic stratification reflects an ancient pattern of population movement and displacement. Genetic evidence suggests that when new groups arrived in the North Caucasus from the steppes to the north and northeast, they forced earlier indigenous populations to relocate from the foothills into the high mountains. The Ossetians arrived perhaps between 1000 BCE and 500 CE, while Turkic-speaking groups arrived around 1000 to 1500 CE. Their arrival pushed earlier Caucasian-speaking populations upward into the mountains, creating the vertical stratification we see today. The high-altitude populations tend to carry genetic markers associated with the most ancient Caucasian lineages, while lowland populations show more evidence of mixture with later arriving groups. Yet, even with these movements and mixtures, the fundamental genetic structure established in the Bronze Age has remained remarkably stable. Even more intriguing, some individuals from the northeastern dry steppes of the North Caucasus region show genetic traces hinting at deep connections to people in Siberia, Northeast Asia, and even the Americas. These far-flung connections remind us that Eurasia was the site of many chapters in human prehistory that we are only beginning to understand. The Caucasus was not an isolated backwater, but a region thoroughly enmeshed in the great movements of peoples that shaped the prehistoric world. When we step back and consider the full picture painted by genetic research, several key insights emerge. First, the Caucasus has been home to distinct genetic lineages for at least 45,000 years, since the CHG lineage separated from other European hunter-gatherers. Second, these ancient Caucasian populations contributed significantly to the genetic ancestry of peoples far beyond the region, particularly through the formation of steppe populations that later spread across Europe and into Asia. Third, despite numerous invasions, migrations, and cultural transformations over the millennia, the populations of the Caucasus have maintained remarkable genetic continuity, with modern groups like the Mingrelians showing clear connections to Bronze Age populations in the same regions that can be traced through both mitochondrial DNA, Y chromosome lineages, and genome-wide autosomal markers. Fourth, the relationship between genes, language, and culture in the Caucasus is complex and often surprising. Linguistic affiliation does not always predict genetic relationships, as the cases of Armenians and Azerbaijanis clearly demonstrate through the elite dominance model. Yet at the same time, there is a striking correlation between language families and genetic signatures within the region itself, suggesting that while populations have sometimes adopted new languages from outsiders, the internal linguistic diversity of the Caucasus reflects genuine ancient population differences that formed at least by the Bronze Age. Finally, the mountainous geography of the region has shaped its genetic landscape in profound ways, creating barriers to gene flow that have preserved ancient lineages, while also facilitating vertical patterns of interaction that have their own genetic signatures visible in sex-specific markers. The Caucasus has served simultaneously as a refuge, preserving ancient diversity that contributed to the formation of European populations, and as a crossroads, facilitating contacts between vastly different populations while maintaining local genetic continuity across millennia.
Chapter 3: Gods and Prophets in the Mountains. To understand the soul of the Caucasus, one must understand its gods. Long before the great monotheistic faiths swept across this mountainous land, the valleys and peaks echoed with invocations to deities whose names are now half forgotten, spirits of nature whose power once shaped every aspect of daily life. The religious journey of the Caucasus is not a simple tale of enlightenment replacing superstition, but rather a complex layering of beliefs, a palimpsest where traces of ancient faiths remain visible beneath later traditions, where sacred mountains and holy springs retain their power even as the prayers offered at them change. In the ancient world, before Christianity or Islam had even been conceived, the peoples of the Caucasus lived in a cosmos populated by gods and spirits. Yet this was not a unified religious landscape. Each valley, each tribe, each community had its own understanding of the divine forces that governed existence. Consider the ancient Georgians of the Kingdom of Iberia. Their cosmos was structured around a celestial duality that might surprise us. While in many ancient cultures the sun represented masculine power and the moon feminine mystery, the Georgian pagans reversed this arrangement. For them, the supreme deity was the male moon, depicted as a warrior, fierce and protective. To honor him, bulls were sacrificed, their blood offered to secure his favor. The choice of the bull was deliberate. The animal's horns, curving upward like a crescent moon, made it the perfect sacrificial victim, an earthly mirror of the celestial god. The second deity in importance was the female sun, goddess of fertility and crops, whose warmth brought forth the harvests upon which life depended. Below these stood Quiviria, who ruled the world and served as mediator between the supreme creator Morigi Kermerti and ordinary humans. As Georgian culture developed, this pantheon became more elaborate. The deity Armazi represented the male moon and cosmic order. His daughter Barbale embodied sun and fertility. Between the divine realm and humanity stood Quiviria, the necessary intermediary. The Georgian religious imagination populated the mountains with angelic beings and heroes who fought against the evil forces called devs. Kopala, Laksari, and Pirkushi, their names preserved in legends even after Christianity's arrival. To the south, in what would become Armenia, the ancient inhabitants were nature worshippers who saw divine power in eagles soaring above mountains, in lions representing strength, in the sun bringing warmth. They called themselves Aravortic, children of the sun, and their supreme deity was Ar, the sun god who gave life to all things. The god Tork Angeg symbolized strength and power. But the most profound transformation occurred during the first millennium before our era, under Persian Achaemenid domination. The supreme god Aramazad, creator of heaven and earth, bore unmistakable similarities to the Persian Ahura Mazda of Zoroastrianism. The goddess of fertility became Anahit, modeled on Persian Anahita. This religious synthesis created a hybrid system where Armenian and Persian beliefs merged, where ancient gods took on Persian characteristics, and Persian deities were reimagined in Armenian forms. Zoroastrianism, the ancient Persian faith founded by the prophet Zarathustra, taught that the universe was the stage for a cosmic struggle between good and evil, between forces of light led by Ahura Mazda and those of darkness led by Angra Mainyu. Fire was sacred, a symbol of truth and purity, and fire temples became centers of worship where priests tended eternal flames that symbolized the undying divine light. In the region of Atropatena, from which modern Azerbaijan's name ultimately derives, Zoroastrianism found its strongest Caucasian foothold. From the 6th century before our era until the 7th century of our era, Atropatena became the very center of Zoroastrianism. In Ganzak, the capital, a great fire temple housed an eternal flame, tended by priests who maintained the sacred fire day and night, never allowing it to be extinguished. These temples were architectural marvels, designed so that the flames would be visible from great distances, beacons of the divine light that followers believed illuminated the path to truth. The influence of Zoroastrianism penetrated deeply into Armenian culture as well. The most striking evidence appears in sacred art. The distinctive cross stones, called khachkars, elaborate monuments carved with intricate crosses, often feature a fiery Zoroastrian sun circle beneath the cross. When Armenians converted to Christianity, they did not abandon their ancestral symbols, but reinterpreted them, incorporating the sacred fire into Christian expression like a fossil of an earlier faith embedded in a later formation. Further north, among the Vainakh peoples, ancestors of today's Chechens and Ingush, religious life followed its own path. The most ancient beliefs were animistic, dating to the Paleolithic when humans first recognized spiritual power in animals, plants, and natural features. Over time, these evolved into totemism, where clans identified with particular animals, and then into paganism, with multiple gods and goddesses. This framework persisted until remarkably late, with paganism lasting among the Vainakh until the 16th century. The 4th century of our era marks one of the great turning points in Caucasian religious history. This was when Christianity reached the Caucasus and began its dramatic transformation of the spiritual landscape. Armenia holds the distinction of being the first nation to adopt Christianity as its official state religion. In the year 301, King Tredat the Great declared Christianity the official faith and founded what became the Armenian Apostolic Church. According to tradition, the conversion was the work of Saint Gregory the Illuminator, who convinced the king of Christianity's truth and then oversaw systematic Christianization. Initially, liturgy was conducted in Greek and Syriac, creating a problem. How could ordinary Armenians embrace a faith whose sacred texts remained inaccessible? The solution came in the early 5th century, when the scholar Mesrop Mashtots undertook a revolutionary project. He created the Armenian alphabet specifically to translate the Bible and liturgical texts into Armenian. This was not merely technical achievement, but an act of cultural and spiritual liberation. The Armenian language became a sacred tongue, and the alphabet became a symbol of national identity. In 451, church leaders gathered at the Council of Chalcedon to resolve theological disputes about Christ's nature. The council formulated a doctrine stating Christ possessed two distinct natures, divine and human, united in one person. The Armenian Church rejected this. Armenian theologians argued Christ was one person with two natures, inseparably joined, divine and human, merged into a unified whole. This theological split had profound consequences. The Armenian Apostolic Church separated from Byzantine Orthodoxy and aligned with other Oriental Orthodox churches of Syria, Ethiopia, and Egypt. This split also had political dimensions. The Sasanian Persians, perceiving Christianity as dangerous alliance with rival Byzantium, attempted to force Armenians to convert to Zoroastrianism. They appointed a governor, introduced punitive taxes, terminated the church's tax-free status, and appointed a Zoroastrian leader to the Supreme Court. Armenian resistance received no Byzantine support, reinforcing the church's movement toward full independence. Later, when Arab Muslim forces conquered much of the Caucasus, they implemented relatively tolerant policy toward Armenian Christians, allowing them to practice in exchange for special taxes. Under Mongol rule in the 13th century, the church initially enjoyed privileged status until the Mongol elite converted to Islam and Christian institutions came under attack. The Georgian path to Christianity followed a different trajectory. Christianity arrived in eastern Georgia, the Kingdom of Iberia, in the early 4th century. The story centers on Saint Nino, who, according to Georgian tradition, first converted Queen Nana through miraculous healing, and then King Mirian himself after he was struck blind, and his sight restored only when he called upon the Christian God. With royal sponsorship, Christianity spread rapidly. As in Armenia, a native alphabet proved crucial. The Georgian alphabet, invented in the 5th century, enabled Bible translation and liturgy in Georgian. Christianity became authentically Georgian, expressed in Georgian words and cultural forms. Yet Georgian Christianity took a different theological path. While both churches initially shared similar traditions, the split came in the 7th and 8th centuries. The Georgian church aligned with Byzantine Orthodox tradition, accepting the Chalcedonian formulations that Armenians had rejected. Despite their geographic proximity and shared early Christianization, the Georgian Orthodox and Armenian Apostolic churches followed different doctrines and cultivated distinct liturgical traditions. Between these two great Christian kingdoms lay another, the Caucasian Albanian Church, centered among the Udis and other peoples of what is now Azerbaijan and southern Dagestan. Founded in the 6th century, the Albanian Church achieved autocephalic status, meaning it was self-governing, with its own hierarchy independent of other Christian authorities. The Albanians developed their own alphabet and written tradition, translating religious texts and creating a distinct Christian culture. For over a millennium, the Albanian Church maintained its independence, though its territory gradually shrank as Islam spread through the region following the Arab conquest. By the early 19th century, when the Russian Empire absorbed the South Caucasus, only small communities of Albanian Christians remained. In 1836, the Russian authorities dissolved the Caucasian Albanian Church entirely, transferring its remaining parishes to the Armenian Apostolic Church. Today, the Udis, numbering only a few thousand, preserve fragments of this once vibrant Christian tradition. In western Georgia, Christianity spread more slowly. The Kingdom of Colchis, along with Abkhazia and Lazika, were Christianized in the 5th and 6th centuries. Throughout these regions, Christian conversion meant adapting earlier sacred sites. Mountains that had been holy to pagan gods became Christian pilgrimage sites. Springs associated with ancient spirits were rededicated to saints. The sacred geography persisted even as religious interpretation changed. The 7th century brought yet another religious transformation. Arab-Muslim armies swept out of Arabia and conquered vast territories. When they reached the Caucasus, they brought Islam. Islam entered primarily along the Caspian coast. Arab conquest established Muslim rule, and over following centuries, Islam spread through force and persuasion. In Azerbaijan, by the 11th century, Turkic-speaking Seljuks, already Muslim, accelerated Islamization. Sunni Islam became dominant in regions like Mugan and along the Caspian. Between the 13th and 15th centuries, Sufism, Islam's mystical tradition, spread its influence. Sufi orders like the Naqshbandiya and Qadiriyya emphasized direct personal experience of the divine through spiritual discipline and devotion to charismatic teachers. In the 16th century, when the Safavid dynasty declared Shia Islam as Persia's state religion, Azerbaijan underwent another transformation, shifting from predominantly Sunni to predominantly Shia Islam. In the North Caucasus, Islam spread through different routes. Among Chechens and other Vaynaq peoples, Islam gradually replaced earlier paganism and Zoroastrian influence. A script based on Arabic letters was created for Chechen in the 18th century, though literacy remained primarily associated with religious education. Sufism played a particularly important role, with Sufi brotherhoods providing both spiritual guidance and social organization. These orders operated through small cells that proved resilient even under later Tsarist and Soviet persecution. Pilgrimage to the graves of Sufi leaders became an important practice, with devotees tying handkerchiefs to trees near sacred sites as offerings and prayers. Yet conversion to Islam did not erase earlier practices. Animal sacrifices continued within Islamic framework. Clans maintained visits to sacred mountains and springs. Traditional memorial practices crossed religious boundaries, wearing black, growing beards for mourning, observing 7th and 40th day memorials after deaths. These customs were shared by Muslims, Christians, and the few remaining Jews alike. The Jewish presence in the Caucasus, though always small, stretched back centuries. Mountain Jews in Azerbaijan and Dagestan and Georgian Jews maintained distinct communities numbering between 15 and 30,000 at their peak. They played important roles in trade and crafts, maintaining their religious traditions through long periods of both tolerance and persecution. In the late 20th century, most emigrated to Israel, though small communities remain. The most striking example of religious syncretism may be the Ingaloy people of the Georgian-Azerbaijani borderlands, Georgian-speaking Shiite Muslims who wear Maltese crosses on their clothing, a vivid symbol of the multiple religious layers that characterize Caucasian culture. The 20th century brought dramatic transformation. When Bolsheviks established Soviet power after the Russian Civil War, they launched aggressive campaigns against all religions. Over 1,000 Orthodox churches in Georgia alone were destroyed or closed. Mosques were converted to secular purposes. Religious officials were executed or imprisoned. The state promoted atheism as modern socialist consciousness. Yet religion proved resilient. During World War II, faced with Nazi invasion, Stalin pragmatically allowed reopening churches and mosques to mobilize support. In 1943, he met with Orthodox leaders and permitted limited religious activity. After the war, repression resumed, but never completely eradicated faith. In private homes, in remote villages, in believers' hearts, religious traditions survived. When the Soviet Union collapsed, religion experienced dramatic revival. New churches and mosques were built, old ones restored, religious education flourished. The governments of Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia declared freedom of religion, though in practice, Orthodox Christianity in Georgia and Armenia and Islam in Azerbaijan retained considerable influence. Today, the religious landscape remains as diverse as throughout history. Georgian Orthodox and Armenian Apostolic Christianity continue shaping their nation's identities. Islam, both Sunni and Shia, claims millions across Azerbaijan and the North Caucasus. And beneath it all, like underground streams feeding visible springs, old beliefs persist in transformed ways, in places holy for millennia, in practices whose origins lie deep in the pagan past. The Caucasus has been Christian for more than 16 centuries, Muslim for nearly 14, yet it remains in some deep sense also pagan and Zoroastrian. Its religious life a living archive of humanity's long search for meaning and connection with the divine. Chapter 4. The Mountain of Languages. When the 10th century Arab geographer al-Azizi first encountered the Caucasus, he gave it a name that has resonated through the centuries: Jabal al-Alsun, the Mountain of Languages. Centuries earlier, the Roman historian Pliny had marveled that Roman administrators required 134 interpreters to communicate with the various peoples they encountered in this region. These were not exaggerations born of ignorance or wonder, but accurate observations of a linguistic reality that remains extraordinary even today. In an area roughly the size of California, approximately 50 distinct languages are spoken, representing not merely dialects of a few major tongues, but languages as different from one another as English is from Chinese. To appreciate the true magnitude of this diversity, consider that the entire European continent, stretching from Portugal to the Ural Mountains, is home to fewer distinct language families than this single mountainous region wedged between two seas. While Europe's languages predominantly belong to the Indo-European family, the Caucasus harbors 4 completely unrelated language families that evolved nowhere else on Earth, plus representatives of several families common elsewhere. This concentration rivals only the highlands of New Guinea, another region where rugged terrain isolated communities for millennia. Yet, unlike New Guinea's Neolithic cultures, the Caucasus has been home to literate civilizations and complex states for thousands of years, making its linguistic diversity unique in the annals of human geography. The foundation of this diversity lies in the indigenous Caucasian language families, which linguists divide into three distinct groups based on geography and structure. The Northwest Caucasian family occupies the western portion of the North Caucasus. The Northeast Caucasian or Dagestanian family dominates the eastern portion. The South Caucasian or Kartvelian family is found primarily in Georgia and neighboring areas. The relationship among these three families remains contested among linguists, with some arguing they descend from a common ancestor language spoken perhaps 8,000 years ago, while others maintain they are utterly unrelated, their similarities the result of millennia of contact rather than common descent. The Northwest Caucasian languages present perhaps the most distinctive phonological systems in the world. These languages are famous among linguists for having enormous consonant inventories combined with minimal vowel systems. Uzbek, a language of this family that became extinct in 1992 when its last speaker died in Turkey, held the world record with 81 consonant sounds. To put this in perspective, English has roughly 24 consonants. The Uzbek people had been entirely expelled from the Caucasus in the 19th century, their language surviving in diaspora until that final Turkish farmer carried it to his grave. The surviving Northwest Caucasian languages include Abkhaz, spoken by approximately 150,000 people in Abkhazia and neighboring regions, and the Circassian languages, divided into Adige and Kabardian. Kabardian alone has some 600,000 speakers scattered across several republics of the North Caucasus. These languages share striking features: complex consonant clusters that can produce words with no vowels at all, and verb systems that encode in a single word information that would require entire sentences in languages like English. Yet, even these languages face pressure from Russian as the language of education, administration, and economic opportunity. Moving eastward across the Caucasus, we encounter the Northeast Caucasian, or Dagestanian language family, which presents linguistic diversity of a different but equally remarkable kind. While the Northwest Caucasian languages are few in number but structurally extreme, the Northeast Caucasian family comprises dozens of distinct languages, many spoken by communities numbering only in the thousands or even hundreds. Dagestan, the northeastern corner of the Caucasus, contains more than 30 major languages within an area smaller than South Carolina. Among these are languages unknown to all but specialists: Tsez, spoken by perhaps 15,000 people, Hunzib, with only 2,000 speakers, Kwarshi and Beshta, each spoken by mere hundreds. The vertical organization of these languages reveals much about the history of the region. The Tsezic languages, including Beshta, Hunzib, Dido, Hinuch, and Kwarshi, are spoken at the highest altitudes along the crest of the mountain range. Linguistic analysis suggests these languages represent the earliest branch to split from the common ancestor of the Northeast Caucasian family. When new peoples arrived in the North Caucasus, they pushed earlier inhabitants upward into the mountains, where isolation in steep valleys preserved linguistic distinctions. At medium altitudes, we find the Andic languages: Akhvakh, Andi, Bagvalal, Batlich, Chamalal, Godoberi, Karata, and Tindi. These represent a somewhat later split in the family tree. Finally, at the lowest altitudes, we encounter Avar, spoken by more than 1 million people and serving as a lingua franca across much of Dagestan. This vertical stratification creates asymmetric multilingualism. Men from highland villages traditionally participate in seasonal migrations to lowland regions, learning the languages of lower villages in the process. A Tsez speaker might learn Avar to communicate at the market, while an Avar speaker has no need to learn Tsez. The complexity extends beyond mere vocabulary and grammar. The Northeast Caucasian languages employ noun class systems that categorize all nouns into groups, with verbs and adjectives changing their forms to agree with the class of the noun they relate to. These are not arbitrary groupings, but reflect deep semantic categories, often distinguishing male humans, female humans, animals, and inanimate objects, with further subdivisions that can seem bewildering to outsiders. The South Caucasian, or Kartvelian family, presents yet another facet of the region's diversity. This family includes Georgian, the official language of the Georgian nation, spoken by approximately 4 million people; Svan, spoken by 15,000 people in the high valleys of northern Georgia; Mingrelian, with 500,000 speakers in western Georgia; and Laz, spoken by 30,000 people primarily in Turkey. While these languages share a common ancestor, they have diverged considerably over thousands of years. Georgian itself is remarkable in several respects. It has its own unique alphabet, created in the 5th century and among the 14 alphabets in current use worldwide. This distinctive rounded script serves not merely as a writing system, but as a symbol of Georgian cultural identity. Georgian has been a literary language for more than 15 centuries, with a written tradition extending back to the earliest days of Christian conversion in the region. The Georgian verb system achieves a complexity that can reduce experienced linguists to bewilderment, with verbs indicating not only tense and aspect, but also evidentiality and version, encoding information that would require multiple sentences in English. Overlaying these indigenous Caucasian families are languages from families common elsewhere, but which have found homes in the Caucasus through various historical processes. The Indo-European family is represented in the Caucasus by 3 quite different languages. Armenian occupies a unique position within the Indo-European family, constituting its own branch, as different from its Indo-European cousins as any of them are from each other. The Armenian language created its own alphabet in the year 405, the work of the scholar Mesrop Mashtots. This alphabet, with its 38 letters, enabled the translation of the Bible and other religious texts into Armenian, creating a rich literary tradition that has endured for 16 centuries. Like the Georgian alphabet, the Armenian script serves as a powerful symbol of national identity, a visual marker of cultural distinctiveness that has survived centuries of foreign domination. Ossetian represents a completely different strand of Indo-European presence in the Caucasus. This language is the sole surviving descendant of the Scythian and Sarmatian languages, once spoken across the vast Eurasian steppes. When these nomadic Iranian peoples were pushed southward by later migrations, some found refuge in the Central Caucasus, where their language evolved in isolation. Today, Ossetian is spoken by perhaps 500,000 people in North Ossetia and South Ossetia. While the Scythian and Sarmatian languages vanished from the steppes, conquered by Turkic and Slavic expansion, a remnant survived in the mountains, preserved by geographic isolation. The Turkic languages came relatively late to the Caucasus, but achieved significant presence through a process linguists call elite dominance, wherein small invading groups impose their languages on larger resident populations. Azerbaijani, spoken by more than 8 million people in Azerbaijan and neighboring regions, belongs to the Oghuz branch of Turkic. It arrived in the region around the 11th century with the Seljuk invasions and gradually displaced earlier languages through a combination of conquest, prestige, and population movement. Other Turkic languages have more limited distributions. Kumyk, spoken by several 100,000 people in Dagestan, represents the northwestern Kipchak branch of Turkic. Karachay and Balkar, spoken in the western North Caucasus, belong to the same branch and are so similar as to be mutually intelligible. Nogai, another Kipchak language, is spoken in scattered communities. These Turkic languages serve as reminders of the various waves of Turkic-speaking peoples who entered the region over the centuries. The linguistic complexity of the Caucasus raises profound questions about the nature of language, identity, and culture. Why has this region preserved such extraordinary diversity while neighboring areas underwent linguistic consolidation? The answer lies partly in geography. The mountain valleys of the Caucasus provide natural refugia, isolated pockets where small communities could maintain their distinct identities over millennia. But geography alone cannot explain the persistence of diversity. Cultural factors matter equally. The peoples of the Caucasus have historically maintained strong clan and community loyalties that coincide with linguistic boundaries. To speak one's ancestral language is to claim membership in a specific community, to participate in traditions that extend back through countless generations. The phenomenon of multilingualism further complicates the picture. Many Caucasians speak 3, 4, or even more languages. A Dagestani might speak his native village language at home, Avar at the regional market, Russian in official contexts, and perhaps some Arabic for religious purposes. This multilingualism means that individuals can maintain their mother tongue while also participating in broader networks of communication. Yet this diversity now faces unprecedented threats. The spread of mass education in Russian, the economic pressures that drive rural populations towards cities where Russian dominates, and the overwhelming presence of Russian-language media all erode the transmission of minority languages to younger generations. Many of the smaller Northeast Caucasian languages are now spoken fluently only by the older generation, with children understanding but not actively using them or not learning them at all. The Soviet period brought specific pressures. In the 1920s, as part of an anti-Islamic campaign, languages were forcibly shifted from Arabic script to Latin script. Then in the 1930s, during intensified Russification, they were shifted again from Latin to Cyrillic, disrupting written traditions and severing communities from their historical texts. Russian became the language of advancement, creating powerful incentives for linguistic assimilation. While larger languages like Georgian, Armenian, and Azerbaijani maintained official status and educational systems, smaller languages had no such protection. Today, efforts at language preservation face mixed prospects. The larger languages with literary traditions and official status will likely survive, though even they face challenges from global languages like English and Russian. Medium-sized languages with tens of thousands of speakers, such as the Lezgians with 1 million speakers or Chechens with 2 million, have fighting chances if communities mobilize to promote them. But the smallest languages, those spoken by only hundreds or thousands of people in remote villages, face existential threats.
The loss of these languages represents more than the loss of communication tools. Each language embodies a unique perspective on reality, a distinct way of categorizing experience, a separate cultural encyclopedia. When a language dies, we lose not just words, but the accumulated wisdom, stories, and ways of thinking of countless generations. The oral traditions, the subtle distinctions in vocabulary for local plants and weather patterns, the grammatical patterns that reflect different ways of understanding time, causation, and human relationships, all disappear. Yet the story of Caucasian languages is not simply one of loss and decline. Georgian and Armenian have successfully navigated the transition to modern national languages, maintaining their distinctiveness while incorporating the vocabulary needed for contemporary life. Efforts to document endangered languages have intensified, with linguists working to record grammars, dictionaries, and oral traditions before they vanish. Some communities have launched language revitalization programs, creating schools where children learn ancestral tongues alongside Russian. The languages of the Caucasus thus stand today at a crossroads. They carry within them the echoes of ancient migrations, the memories of isolated mountain communities, the adaptations to changing political and cultural circumstances. They represent human cognitive diversity, different solutions to the universal human challenge of using sound to communicate meaning. Whether they will continue to flourish or gradually succumb to the homogenizing pressures of modernity remains an open question, one whose answer will be written in the choices of communities deciding which languages to pass to their children and which to let slip into silence.
Chapter 5. 5 Centuries of Mountain Resistance. The collision between the Russian state and the peoples of the Caucasus is not a recent phenomenon born of 20th century ideologies or modern geopolitics, but rather a conflict whose roots stretch back nearly 5 centuries. This prolonged struggle, marked by periods of intense warfare and uneasy coexistence, has shaped the identities of both the Russian state and the Caucasian peoples in profound and often tragic ways. To understand the Caucasus today, one must understand this history of resistance and conquest, of empires expanding and mountain peoples defending their independence with a ferocity that would become legendary. The story begins in the middle of the 16th century, during the reign of Ivan the Terrible, when the expanding Muscovite state first cast its eyes southward toward the Caucasus Mountains. In 1556, Russian forces captured the city of Astrakhan, establishing control over the mouth of the Volga River where it empties into the Caspian Sea. This conquest brought Russia into direct contact with the peoples of the North Caucasus and fundamentally altered the strategic landscape of the region. Initially, Ivan sought to establish peaceful relations with at least some Caucasian peoples. His marriage in 1561 to Maria Temrikovna, a Kabardian noblewoman, represented an attempt to create political ties with the powerful Kabardian princes who controlled the central North Caucasus. For a time, this strategy seemed successful, aligning Kabardia with Russian interests and providing Ivan with allies in the region. But when Maria died in 1569, the alliance deteriorated rapidly. The Kabardians, along with their neighbors the Kumyks and Nogais, launched raids against Russian positions, signaling their rejection of Russian authority. The Kumyks, a Turkic people residing in what is now Dagestan, mounted some of the most organized and effective early resistance to Russian expansion. The Russian Kumyk Wars of the 16th and 17th centuries established patterns that would recur throughout the centuries of conflict. In 1560, Russian forces plundered Tarki, the capital of the Kumyk state. This initial success proved temporary. Under pressure from the Crimean Tatars, who saw Russian expansion as a threat to their own interests, the Russians were forced to retreat. 30 years later, in 1591, Moscow's armies launched another campaign against the Kumyks. This expedition resulted in the wounding of the Kumyk ruler and extracted promises of submission. Yet these promises meant little. When imperial troops returned in 1594, the Kumyks repelled them decisively. The final campaign of this early period came in 1607, when Kumyk forces almost completely destroyed the invading Russian army. This defeat was so complete that Russia largely withdrew from active involvement in the Caucasus for more than a century, focusing instead on consolidating control over more accessible territories.
The respite ended in the early 18th century when Tsar Peter the Great, determined to transform Russia into a European power, embarked on a series of campaigns to extend Russian reach into the Caucasus. Peter understood that control of the region would provide access to crucial trade routes linking Europe to Persia and the East, to rich agricultural lands capable of producing tea, tobacco, cotton, walnuts, and citrus fruits, and to mineral wealth, including gold, iron, zinc, copper, coal, and oil. Most critically, the Caucasus offered potential routes to the warm water ports that Russia's strategic position seemed to eternally deny it. His campaigns marked the beginning of consistent Russian intervention in the region, interventions that would grow in scale and intensity over the following 2 centuries. Yet, it was in the 19th century that the conflict between Russia and the Caucasian peoples reached its most intense and consequential phase. The period from 1817 to 1864 is known as the Caucasian War, though this single name encompasses multiple distinct conflicts involving different peoples across the vast sweep of the Caucasus Mountains. This was not a conventional war between organized states, but rather a prolonged struggle between an expanding empire and numerous mountain peoples fighting to preserve their independence. In the Eastern Caucasus, resistance coalesced around religious leadership, transforming what might have been merely ethnic or territorial conflicts into a religious struggle against Christian Russian domination. The figure of Sheikh Mansour, who led a resistance movement from 1785 to 1791, pioneered this fusion of religious fervor and military resistance. Mansour, a Chechen religious leader, proclaimed a holy war against Russian expansion and succeeded in uniting various North Caucasian peoples in opposition to Russian rule. Though his movement was ultimately crushed and Mansour himself captured, he established a template that later leaders would follow. The organizational foundation for this resistance came from Sufi Islamic orders, particularly the Naqshbandi and Qadari tariqas, which provided a network of small cells capable of coordinating action across tribal and ethnic boundaries.
These Sufi brotherhoods offered more than spiritual guidance. They created a resilient structure of leadership and communication that would survive Tsarist persecution and, later, communist-era repression. Muslim clerics trained in these traditions played a significant role in organizing and sustaining resistance, their religious authority transcending the traditional clan loyalties that might otherwise have fragmented opposition to Russian rule. The most formidable resistance came under Imam Shamil, who led the Caucasian imamate from 1828 to 1859. Shamil was not merely a military leader, but a political and religious figure who created a theocratic state in the mountains of Dagestan and Chechnya. Under his leadership, disparate mountain communities united under the banner of Islam and the principle of independence from Russian control. Shamil's forces employed guerrilla tactics perfectly suited to the mountain terrain, ambushing Russian columns in narrow defiles, striking supply lines, and melting away into the mountains when faced with superior forces. The most formidable resistance came under Imam Shamil, who led the Caucasian imamate from 1828 to 1859. Shamil was not merely a military leader, but a political and religious figure who created a theocratic state in the mountains of Dagestan and Chechnya. Under his leadership, disparate mountain communities united under the banner of Islam and the principle of independence from Russian control. Shamil's forces employed guerrilla tactics perfectly suited to the mountain terrain, ambushing Russian columns in narrow defiles, striking supply lines, and melting away into the mountains when faced with superior forces. The struggle against Shamil became an obsession for the Russian military, absorbing enormous resources and attention. Imperial forces, accustomed to fighting conventional European armies on open battlefields, found themselves frustrated by an enemy who refused to engage in set-piece battles. The mountain fighters knew every path and pass in the terrain and enjoyed the support of local populations who saw them as defenders rather than rebels. For more than 30 years, Shamil defied Russian power, his very existence a challenge to imperial prestige. The war in the East was brutal and destructive. Russian commanders adopted a strategy of systematic devastation, destroying villages, cutting down forests that provided cover for resistance fighters, and relocating populations to break the connection between Shamil's fighters and their bases of support. The construction of fortified lines and the establishment of Cossack settlements to hold conquered territory gradually compressed the area under Shamil's control. The mountain peoples responded with equal ferocity, viewing the conflict as an existential struggle for their freedom and faith. Through sheer persistence and overwhelming resources, Moscow's armies eventually prevailed. In 1859, Shamil was finally captured, ending organized resistance in the Eastern Caucasus. The imam was treated with respect by his captors, who recognized his courage and leadership, and spent his final years in comfortable exile before dying in 1871. But even as resistance collapsed in the east, the Western Caucasus remained unconquered. The Circassians, inhabiting the northwestern slopes of the Caucasus from the Black Sea coast inland, had maintained their independence through centuries of pressure from various powers. Unlike the eastern mountain peoples, many Circassians had traditionally looked to the Ottoman Empire rather than Russia for trade and cultural connections. They saw Russian expansion not as the advance of Christian civilization, but as the destruction of their ancient freedoms. The Russo-Circassian War, which overlapped with but extended beyond the broader Caucasian War, proved even more devastating in its ultimate consequences than the conflict in the East. Russian military strategy in Circassia evolved from attempts at conquest to a program of deliberate ethnic cleansing. Russian commanders concluded that the Circassians would never submit, and that the only solution was their removal from territories that Russia claimed. From 1763 to 1878, systematic pressure was applied to force Circassians from their homeland. Villages were destroyed, populations were driven toward the Black Sea coast, and those who resisted were killed. The Russian state offered Circassians a choice that was hardly a choice at all: resettle in designated areas under Russian control, accepting military colonization and loss of traditional autonomy, or emigrate to the Ottoman Empire. Hundreds of thousands chose or were forced into emigration. Estimates suggest that between 800,000 and 1.5 million Circassians left their homeland, crowding onto ships at Black Sea ports in scenes of desperate chaos. The Ottoman Empire accepted these refugees, who were fellow Muslims and potential settlers for underpopulated regions, but lacked the capacity to properly care for the sudden influx. Thousands died during the sea voyage or in the camps where they were temporarily housed. Circassian communities were scattered across the Ottoman territories, from Anatolia to Syria to Jordan, creating a diaspora that persists to this day. The lands emptied of Circassians were resettled with Russians, Ukrainians, and Cossacks, transforming the demographic character of the western North Caucasus. The Kuban region, once the heartland of Circassian culture, became a predominantly Slavic area, its new inhabitants often unaware of the tragedy that had made their settlement possible. The year 1864 marked the official end of the Caucasian War, with the last Circassian resistance crushed. This victory came at an enormous human cost that scholars today widely recognize as genocide, the deliberate destruction of a people through systematic expulsion, killing, and annihilation of their homeland and culture. The incorporation of the Caucasus into the Russian Empire did not end resistance or bring peace. Throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, rebellions periodically erupted, suppressed with varying degrees of difficulty, but never entirely eliminating the underlying tensions. The peoples of the Caucasus had been conquered, but not reconciled to their conquest. The collapse of the Russian Empire in 1917 briefly offered hope for Caucasian independence. Between 1917 and 1922, various attempts were made to establish independent states. The Mountain Republic of the North Caucasus, the North Caucasian Emirate, and other political formations emerged, claiming sovereignty over territories that had been forcibly incorporated into Russia. These independence movements were short-lived. The Bolsheviks, determined to reconstruct the empire under communist ideology, launched military campaigns to bring the Caucasus back under Russian control. By 1922, Soviet power had been established throughout the region, organized into a complex system of autonomous regions and republics, with Moscow maintaining firm political control. Soviet rule brought a new form of Russian domination, one that combined ideological indoctrination with brutal repression. Yet perhaps nothing during the Soviet period matched the horror of the deportations carried out during World War II. In 1943 and 1944, under the orders of Joseph Stalin and under the direction of Lavrentiy Beria, entire peoples were accused of collaboration with Nazi Germany and deported en masse to Central Asia. The Karachais were deported in November 1943. The Chechens and Ingush were rounded up in February 1944, packed into unheated freight cars during winter with inadequate food and water, and transported thousands of miles to Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. The Balkars followed in March of that year. The logistics were staggering, involving military mobilization to round up hundreds of thousands of people, often giving them only hours to prepare before being forced from their homes. Thousands died during the journey itself. The first years in exile were catastrophic, with mortality rates soaring as displaced populations struggled to survive in unfamiliar environments with minimal support. Estimates suggest that roughly a third of the Chechen and Ingush population died during the deportation and the first years of exile. For more than a decade, these peoples were officially erased from their homelands, their autonomous republics abolished, their villages destroyed or repopulated, even their names removed from Soviet maps. Only after Stalin's death and Nikita Khrushchev's denunciation of some of Stalin's crimes were the deported peoples allowed to return, beginning in 1957. They came back to find their homes occupied by others, their cemeteries desecrated, their mosques converted to other uses or destroyed. The memory of these deportations seared itself into collective consciousness. The date of February 23rd, when the Chechen and Ingush deportations began, remains a day of mourning and remembrance, competing with and sometimes overshadowing Soviet and Russian official holidays. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 once again opened questions of independence and sovereignty. Chechnya declared independence as the Chechen Republic of Ichkeria. The Russian Federation under Boris Yeltsin refused to recognize this independence, fearing that allowing Chechen secession would trigger Russia's disintegration. What followed were two devastating wars that demonstrated the enduring patterns of Russo-Caucasian conflict. The First Chechen War, from 1994 to 1996, saw Russian forces attempt to crush Chechen independence through overwhelming military force. The capital city of Grozny was reduced to rubble through artillery bombardment and airstrikes. Despite their military superiority, imperial troops failed to achieve their objectives. Chechen fighters, intimately familiar with the terrain and enjoying support from local populations, inflicted heavy casualties and made the occupation unsustainable. In 1996, Russia withdrew, signing a peace agreement that left Chechnya effectively independent. This independence lasted only 3 years. In 1999, a new Russian leader, Vladimir Putin, ordered a second military intervention. The Second Chechen War proved even more destructive, with Russian forces employing even more brutal tactics. Grozny was again destroyed, this time even more thoroughly. The conflict evolved from a war for independence into an insurgency increasingly influenced by radical Islamic ideology. Terror attacks on Russian targets, including the horrific school siege in Beslan, North Ossetia, in 2004 that killed more than 300 people, many of them children, hardened Russian public opinion against Chechen independence. Today, Chechnya remains formally part of the Russian Federation, ruled by Ramzan Kadyrov, a former rebel who switched sides and now governs with Moscow's support. The republic has been rebuilt, but this reconstruction came at an enormous cost in lives and freedom. The broader North Caucasus remains turbulent, with sporadic violence erupting in Dagestan, Ingushetia, and other republics. The unresolved status of the North Caucasus within the Russian Federation continues to generate periodic violence and tension, with insurgent attacks and harsh security responses maintaining a cycle of conflict that began nearly 5 centuries ago. The Russo-Caucasian conflict is, at its core, a clash between an expanding imperial power and peoples determined to maintain their independence, identity, and way of life. For Russia, whether ruled by czars, commissars, or presidents, the Caucasus represents strategic territory that cannot be allowed to escape central control. For the Caucasian peoples, Russia represents a perpetual threat to their existence as distinct communities with their own languages, traditions, and destinies. This conflict has shaped both sides profoundly. Russian military doctrine, tactics, and strategy have been forged in the crucible of Caucasian wars. And for the Caucasian peoples, resistance to Russian domination has become central to their identities, a defining characteristic that has survived conquest, deportation, and systematic attempts to erase their distinctiveness. The Caucasus has been conquered repeatedly, but never truly subdued, its peoples demonstrating a resilience and determination that commands respect, even from those who might oppose their political aspirations. Chapter 6. Customs, Kinship, and the Mountain Code. When the Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder attempted to conduct business in Colchis during the 1st century, he reported requiring 134 interpreters to communicate with the various peoples gathered in its markets. This bewildering linguistic diversity, noted by countless chroniclers and travelers across the centuries, formed only the surface of what made the Caucasus distinctive. Beneath the multiplicity of tongues lay something more fundamental: sophisticated cultures that had developed elaborate codes of behavior, refined artistic traditions, and social structures that proved remarkably resilient through millennia of upheaval. These were not primitive tribes, but communities guided by what might be called a mountain code, a set of values that transcended ethnic boundaries and shaped life from the Black Sea to the Caspian. The customs described here represent primarily the traditional practices of the 19th and early 20th centuries, before Soviet collectivization, religious suppression, and modernization transformed mountain life. Yet many of these traditions, adapted and evolved, continue to shape identity and behavior in contemporary Caucasian communities. At the heart of this mountain code lies hospitality, not merely as pleasant custom, but as sacred obligation. The legendary hospitality of the Caucasus represents a deeply ingrained cultural value that can seem almost incomprehensible to those from less communally oriented societies. To be welcomed into a Caucasian home is to enter a relationship governed by ancient protocols. The guest becomes, for the duration of the visit, a person under the protection and care of the host family. This is not a burden reluctantly borne, but an honor eagerly sought. Families take pride in their ability to provide lavish hospitality, and the arrival of visitors, even unexpected ones, triggers preparation of elaborate feasts. The table groans under dishes, far more food than could possibly be consumed, for abundance demonstrates both the prosperity of the host and the depth of respect for the guest. Savory meat dishes, often lamb or beef, prepared according to recipes handed down through generations, occupy places of honor. Pilaf, prepared with rice, meat, and spices, appears at important meals. Breads of various kinds, from flat lavash to substantial loaves, accompany every course. Fresh vegetables when in season, preserved vegetables during winter months, and cheeses both fresh and aged crowd the table alongside sweet pastries, halva, and dried fruits that conclude the meal. But food forms only part of the hospitality ritual. The offering of toasts transforms a meal into a ceremonial occasion. The tamana, or toastmaster, guides the progression of toasts with an art that balances spontaneity and tradition. A skilled tamada possesses eloquence, quick wit, and deep knowledge of tradition. He must read the mood of the gathering, knowing when to turn solemn and when to introduce humor, when to speak briefly and when to elaborate. Early toasts honor ancestors and elders, establishing connection to the past. Later toasts celebrate family, friendship, and the present gathering. The progression must maintain appropriate rhythm, ensuring no one drinks alone while building toward emotional crescendos that bind the company together. A truly gifted tamada can hold a table enthralled for hours, weaving personal anecdotes and universal truths into a performance that guests will remember for years. This hospitality extends beyond the dinner table into all aspects of social life. Traditional mountain etiquette regulates behavior, serving not to stifle spontaneity, but to create a framework within which complex social interactions can proceed smoothly. From childhood, Caucasians are brought up in what might be called a knightly spirit, aimed at preserving honor, defending freedom and independence, being faithful to one's word, and maintaining loyalty to friendship. The ideal holds that a man should live not only for his own sake, but for his family, relatives, friends, and people. The cult of seniority reflects this etiquette in practice. Age brings genuine authority. Elders make important decisions for extended families, mediate disputes, and serve as repositories of traditional knowledge. Their words carry weight because decades of life experience are presumed to have brought wisdom. Children are raised from infancy to show deference, standing when an older person enters the room, speaking only when addressed, accepting guidance without argument. This respect for age connects to broader patterns of social organization based on kinship. The basic domestic unit across much of the Caucasus has traditionally been the extended family, with multiple generations living under one roof or in closely connected households. In some communities, one might find 4 or 5 brothers, each with his nuclear family, living in a single large household. The head of such a household, typically the father or in his absence the eldest son, oversaw the domestic economy and made major decisions. But this authority operated within understood constraints, balanced by the mother's authority over domestic matters. All produce was considered common property. One son and his family might drive livestock to summer pastures one year, another taking on this responsibility the next year, ensuring fairness in labor distribution. Traditional houses reflected both practical needs and cultural values. Many were built with 2 stories, with cattle kept on the lower floor and living quarters on the upper floor. This arrangement provided warmth, security for livestock, and efficient use of limited flat ground. Houses typically included a separate room for entertaining the husband's guests, acknowledging the importance of hospitality. Stone buildings with vine-shrouded courtyards provided refuge from summer heat. In highland areas, houses were frequently built on slopes in terraces, with the roof of one house serving as the courtyard for the house above it.
Within these family structures, children were raised to navigate the complex social and physical environment of the mountains. At age 5 or 6, children began to share in productive work. Girls learned domestic tasks, sewing and knitting, acquiring expertise that would enable them to manage their own households. Boys learned to work with livestock and to ride horses with the skill necessary for mountain terrain. But equally important was moral instruction in local traditions concerning family and social life, the codes of behavior that marked one as a proper member of the community. Marriage practices reveal the intersection of individual desire and communal regulation. Consider the detailed practices preserved among the Hinalog, a small community occupying a single village high in the mountains of Azerbaijan. Their customs, while specific to their community, reflect patterns found with variations throughout the region. Hinalog society was strictly endogamous, with marriage between cousins being particularly preferred. This kept property within extended families, reinforced kinship ties, and ensured that both partners shared the same cultural traditions. In earlier times, betrothals were arranged between very young children. Before Soviet rule, girls typically married at 14 or 15, boys at 20 or 21. Marriages were ordinarily arranged by relatives, with young people themselves not being consulted. If older relatives took a liking to a girl, they would place a scarf on her, announcing their claim for their son or nephew. Once families identified a suitable match, the suitor's father's brother and a more distant senior relative would undertake negotiations at the young woman's home. The mother's consent was considered decisive. Should she refuse, the suitor might attempt abduction, though this was scandalous and could trigger feuds. When agreement was reached, the betrothal ceremony took place. The young man's relatives went to the young woman's home bearing gifts: clothing, soap, halva, raisins, and later candy. These gifts were carried on wooden trays, and the delegation brought 3 rams for the bride's father. The fiancé received a plain metal ring, formalizing the engagement. Between betrothal and wedding, the young man's relatives visited on each festival day, bringing pilaf, sweets, and clothing. Meanwhile, respected elders negotiated the bride price, paid in livestock, rice, and occasionally money. A typical bride price in the 1930s might include 20 rams and a sack of sugar. During engagement, strict avoidance customs governed behavior. The young man could not visit the woman's family and avoided encounters with her and her parents. The young woman covered the lower part of her face with a kerchief in public, but she was busy preparing her dowry, which largely consisted of woolen goods made by her own hands, 5 or 6 carpets, up to 15 carrying sacks, 50 to 60 pairs of knit stockings, and much more. This dowry represented months or years of labor and revealed both the economic importance of women's work and the value placed on the bride's contribution. The wedding took place over 2 or 3 days. The bride, riding a horse and covered by a large red woolen cloth with her face veiled, was escorted to the groom's home. At the threshold, his mother greeted her with honey or sugar. The groom's father or brother slaughtered a ram across which the bride stepped, after which she trod upon a copper tray placed on the threshold, symbolically incorporating her into her new household. She was led to a special room where she remained standing for 2 or more hours, a test of endurance. The groom arrived at midnight. Wedding festivities continued with dancing, wrestling matches accompanied by music, and horse racing. Even after marriage, avoidance customs continued. For up to 2 or 3 years, the bride did not speak to her father-in-law. She likewise maintained silence with her husband's brother or paternal uncle for months. These customs established the bride's position within the family hierarchy and created a gradual process of integration.
Music and dance formed essential elements of Caucasian cultural life, accompanying weddings, festivals, and celebrations. Each ethnic group developed distinctive musical traditions, with instruments ranging from stringed pandours and drums to woodwinds and the polyphonic singing that remains characteristic of Georgian culture. Dance styles varied regionally, from the fierce, martial movements of the lezginka to more graceful courtship dances, but all emphasized both individual skill and communal participation. Oral traditions preserved history, genealogy, and moral instruction across generations. In societies where literacy was limited, skilled storytellers commanded deep respect, able to recite epic poems, genealogies stretching back centuries, and tales that encoded cultural values. These oral traditions maintained collective memory and reinforced identity, even as political boundaries shifted and empires rose and fell. Craft traditions demonstrated both aesthetic sophistication and practical skill. Metalworkers produced not only the daggers that served as symbols of male adulthood, but also intricate jewelry, decorated weapons, and household implements. Women's weaving produced carpets whose patterns identified both region and maker, with techniques passed from mother to daughter. The silver and gold ornaments worn by women featured filigree work and semi-precious stones, representing both artistry and stored wealth. Material culture reflected both environment and identity. Men across the region wore fur caps, with styles varying by community. Daggers worn by men served practical and symbolic functions, marking adult status and readiness to defend honor. Women's traditional attire featured elaborate jewelry and elevated headgear that proclaimed marital status and family prosperity. These cultural traditions, from elaborate marriage ceremonies to codes governing hospitality, from distinctive clothing to architecture adapted to mountain terrain, represent more than preserved customs. They embody values and knowledge accumulated over generations, practical solutions to life's challenges in difficult environments, and expressions of identities that persisted through centuries of change. Soviet modernization brought profound transformations. Collectivization disrupted extended family economies. Religious suppression attacked the spiritual foundations of many customs. Deportations of entire peoples shattered communities. Education and urbanization drew young people away from traditional practices. Yet the essential character of many traditions proved remarkably resilient. Hospitality remained a defining value. Respect for elders continued to shape family dynamics. Marriage celebrations, though modified, still drew communities together in multi-day feasts. What has emerged in contemporary Caucasus is neither pure tradition nor complete abandonment of the past, but rather an ongoing negotiation between inherited practices and modern realities. Urban Caucasians may no longer maintain extended family households, but they still gather for elaborate family celebrations. Young people may choose their own spouses, but weddings still follow recognizable patterns. The Mountain Code, adapted and evolved, continues to connect contemporary Caucasians to ancestors who lived in these same valleys thousands of years ago, providing identity and continuity in a rapidly changing world. The North Caucasus stands as one of humanity's most remarkable living archives. Here, in valleys that sheltered Bronze Age metallurgists 4,000 years ago, genetic lineages persist that helped shape European populations. Languages survive that exist nowhere else on Earth, each encoding unique ways of understanding reality. Religious traditions layer upon one another like geological strata, creating syncretisms found nowhere else. And through 5 centuries of imperial pressure, mountain peoples have maintained identities rooted in codes of honor, hospitality, and kinship that transcend political boundaries. This extraordinary diversity emerged not despite the region's isolation, but because of it. The same mountains that protected ancient cultures from homogenization now struggle to preserve them against modern forces of assimilation. Whether these traditions will endure or gradually fade depends on choices being made today in villages and cities across the Caucasus.
The story of the North Caucasus reminds us that human diversity itself has value worth preserving. Thank you for listening.